Broadcasting live from the School of Athens, this is Europe and the People Without History with Mr. Olton, everyone's favorite AP World History Review service. So, we're going to continue our discussion of the long 19th century, period 5 in the College Board's concept outline for AP World History with key concept 5.2. Key concept 5.2 states that as states industrialized, they also expanded existing overseas empires and established new colonies and transoceanic relationships. Go ahead and pause me and throw that into your own words and see what I got when you are done. All right, so I basically said that industrialization led to imperialism. That's the case. So this key concept, mostly about imperialism. So key concept 5.2, Roman numeral 1, states that industrializing powers established transoceanic empires. Let's see how they did it. It's important to note that industrialism requires overseas expansion. If I'm from England and I want to create a big business that is an industrial one, I'm probably going to need resources from other places. While I had coal at my disposal, I did not have all the other stuff to make the products. Textile manufacturing, as you will know, dominated the first industrial revolution in England, and cotton does not grow in England. While they had wool, wool does not make clothes as awesomely as cotton does. So here are some new products that required Europe to go overseas. Cotton, as we said before, comes from Egypt and India and also the United States. But when the United States goes through its civil war, it forces England elsewhere to find these products, and that's why they end up in places like Egypt and India. Tin, which was an important metal that was used in the industrialization process, can be found in Malaysia, as also other places. Copper, that's used in wiring for electricity, that comes later in the 1800s and the early 1900s, is found in abundance in Latin America. Palm oil, which literally greased the wheels of industrialization, can be found in West Africa. And then, of course, the infamous rubber can be found in the Congo and Southeast Asia. In order to get these things, European countries had to go outside of their own borders. So industrialization also created a need for new consumers. If Europe was going to make an abundance of crap, they needed somebody to sell it to. And since they made so much of it, and Europeans had already bought what they needed to find new people. So who better to sell it to than aristocratic populations overseas? And finally, there's a nationalistic foray between European countries and this sort of competition between them that results in them wanting to outdo each other, and that also contributes to imperialism. So now we have new players in this round of imperialism. The Spanish and the Portuguese have declined in their power for many reasons that were discussed in Period 4's videos, but one to highlight is the fact that England and the Dutch emerge as more powerful and more ruthless players on the world stage. But we see the decline of these powers, and we see the emergence of other ones, notably the British, the Belgians in the Congo, and the United States. And these places gain power in Southeast Asia and Africa specifically. Now, states strengthened their control sometimes over colonies that they already had, or colonies that had already existed within their realm. So, for example, Britain had first made inroads into India in the early 1600s, around the year 1608. But they really don't gain traction there in large amounts until the Battle of Plassey in 1757. This is a battle between the British East India Company and the last remnants of the Mughal Empire, and it ends in a victory for the British East India Company. I have no idea why the hell a company had an army to fight battles, but they did, and as a result, the British East India Company now has influence over pretty much all of India. And as a result, they're able to impose their economic will on the Indian people. This leads to the continuation of the downfall of the Mughal Empire and obviously enrichment of the British East India Company. You also see this with regard to the Dutch in the East Indies. The Dutch had already had inroads into the East Indies. They were a trading post empire, but as their own armies gained power, they start to increase their influence throughout Southeast Asia. So states strengthen control over their existing colonies by entrenching even more power. Okay, so this is going to lead us to probably the most infamous example of imperialism in the area, or in the time period, in the era. And this occurs at the Berlin Conference in 1884-1885. So to give you some context, Belgium had been proving to be particularly annoying and a nuisance to the other countries in Europe because it wanted some imperial claims of its own, and its king, King Leopold II, was being kind of difficult about it. And so he was basically threatening war on a continent that had been particularly stable and peaceful for about 80 years since the Congress of Vienna and the downfall of Napoleon. So European countries were quick to pacify him. So his neighbor, Otto von Bismarck, the chancellor of the newly unified German Empire, calls a meeting of European countries in Berlin, and they decide to cut Africa up, to split it up as you see on the map. So it's important to note that this is a catalyst in turning Africa from this, a largely independent, humongous continent with a lot of natural resources, into this, an almost all imperial and colonized continent with natural resources that are now being extracted. There are two exceptions, Liberia over here, which had the backing of the United States, and Ethiopia over here, which was just awesome in their ability to hold off in encroaching European powers. So now let's talk about how states established these empires more broadly. So some states use diplomacy to establish their empires. This was seen very often with regard to European contracts that were often offered to African kingdoms. Obviously, most African kingdoms were signing these contracts obliviously, and they didn't really know what they were signing. It was similar to when Spain issued the requirement to indigenous people of the Americas, and basically telling them that if they either joined the Spanish ranks or would be turned into slaves. Obviously, they didn't know what to do. They would convert to Christianity or be turned into slaves, and obviously they didn't know what to do. Oftentimes, Africans were found signing these contracts that they had no idea what they said, and were turning most of their land over to the European powers. In addition to that, states also used military invasion to establish their empires. This is seen all over the place, but three notable examples are the French in Algeria, the Belgians in the Congo, and the British in South Africa. The British fight a couple of wars, one against the Zulu nation, and then one, hilariously, against other people of European descent, the Boers, or Dutch farmers that had been in South Africa for a couple hundred years. Now, in addition to that, European colonies also set up what we call settler colonies in parts of the world where they already had empires or were setting up empires rapidly. So a couple examples of these settler colonies where basically the colonizing force sets up a place to send excess population to live. This was done with the British in Australia where they sent convicts to live, and then the French do a similar injustice to Algeria. Economic imperialism is a different type of imperialism. Was practiced in some other parts of the world as well. Economic imperialism is where you don't take over the place that you're trying to influence. Rather, you put pressure on them through economic means. So the United States did this in Latin America, where it promoted Latin American growth by using its own money. And then when Latin America couldn't pay back the loans that the United States had made them, the United States imposed all of these different measures. It's still done today, only instead of countries doing it, we have nice little coded organizations like the IMF and the World Bank who do these types of things. But the United States imposed economic imperialism in Latin America, and European powers and the United States did the same thing in China. So to give you an example of this special kind of economic imperialism, let's talk about a case study. Let's discuss the Opium Wars, which were a series of two wars that took place between the Chinese and the British between 1839 and 1860. There were several things that caused these confrontations, but the major one is that Britain had basically spent all of their money on tea. Their coffers were being run dry, then they didn't have any hard currency. Now they needed this hard currency to pay for factories and other things that required capital down, like railroads and stuff like that. So they needed to find a way to get it back. The problem is that China, which has all in abundance, did not want anything that Britain had to offer. As you can see in the picture illustrated in the bottom right-hand corner, there's Lord Macartney, a British admiral who was sent on an expedition to talk to the Chinese and bring all the cool stuff he had. And the Chinese were like, we don't like any of it. And we don't need any of it, it's all crap. And so the British were kind of at a loss. So finally, after they make inroads into India, they find something that the Chinese like, opium. So basically, figure out a way to get drugs into the hands of the Chinese, and when they sell them opium, now the British will have their money to not only build factories but to buy more tea. So the confrontation comes when China refuses to buy the British opium and actually closes down the port at Canton, the only port that Westerners were allowed to trade in, and dumps all of the opium into the ocean. Now, Britain responds in the way that Westerners usually respond to things like this, with guns, and as a result, the Chinese lose the war because they were not as industrialized as the British were, and they have to sign the humiliating Treaty of Nanking in 1842. This treaty allows Britain to trade at 5 Chinese ports now instead of one, gives them perpetual ownership of Hong Kong, and also allows them to establish what we call a sphere of influence. A sphere of influence is basically an area of China that Britain was allowed to control, basically pass laws to dictate and control the economy of. Okay, this is a sphere of influence. Britain wasn't the only one who had a sphere of influence in China. Eventually, other Western powers like the United States, like Germany, like France, like the Dutch, will also have spheres of influence. So how is this different than other types of imperialism? Well, Britain does not take China over. China is much too strong for a European power to take over legitimately. They have way too many people. They just sort of open up access to it. And since China had been isolated for several years, it made sense that Europe and the United States wanted access to China, so they set up spheres of influence instead. It was kind of opposite day because China had all of the buyers. It was the most populous country in the world, and the West had all the stuff. Oh, how things change. Okay, key concept 5.2, Roman numeral 2. Imperialism influenced state formation and contraction around the world. So imperialism impacted the various state formations in different places of the world. This is best seen in Japan, so they're going to be our case study for this one. In 1854, the United States sails a flotilla of ships to the shores of Japan, and they meet up with the Tokugawa shogunate, which had kept Japan isolated for about 250 years. And instead of being nice, the Americans basically tell Japan that you will open your borders up to us and our trade, or we will attack you. Now, this is the same thing that Britain did in China. The difference becomes that Japan actually reacts in uh, favor of westernization. So, anti Tokugawa forces eventually raise armies and fight against the shogunate and eventually destroy the now outgunned samurai warriors. And these anti shogunate forces put the emperor back on the throne as a sovereign leader of Japan. Now, he was more of a puppet and more of a figurehead, but definitely different with regard to power than the shogunate had been. Now, as a result of this, Japan accepts westernization, so it becomes a major industrial power in the area and displays this power in 2 wars in the late 18 and early 1900s, one against China, in which the Japanese win, and one against Russia, in which the Japanese win. So Japan obviously now becomes the dominant power in what used to be the Chinese and the Russians' land. Okay, so countries, in addition to countries forming as a result of imperialism, countries also expand their borders by conquering adjacent areas. This is best seen in the United States, where the United States purchases, but then also through conflict adds area to its landmass. It does so through the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, where it buys the Louisiana Territory from France, but it also does so in the Mexican-American War, which rages from 1848 to 1846, in which the United States basically stages an attack against the Mexican army, provoking them into war, and then forces the Mexicans into giving up California, New Mexico, and Utah, so much of the West. Russia also uses conquest to expand its borders, as you can see in the map right here. It settles further and further east as time goes on, and then Russians move there to settle for resources, and recently industrialized Japan even gets on the expansion of their borders by conquering neighboring islands, and then eventually comes to control Korea. So one ways that countries can respond to imperialism is by expanding their own borders. And now, imperialism elicited several other different types of reactions from around the world. So these are going to be how non-industrialized places responded. So let's talk about some places formed reactionary states. So you actually see the formation of political entities that are in response to imperialism. This is best exemplified by Shaka, Zulu, and the Zulu Kingdom in South Africa. Obviously, while they're successful for a short time in unifying a lot of African tribes in the southern part of Africa, they eventually succumb to European pressure and European military might. You sometimes see the successful defensive kingdoms, as illustrated by Ethiopia and their leader Menelik II, in their thwarting of an Italian invasion in the late 1800s. In addition to Ethiopia, it's not listed here, but Thailand, which was then called Siam, also repelled European invasions, both examples of successful deterrence to imperialism. You see some places fight for their own independence, so the formation of new countries in the face of imperialism. Obviously, the Ottomans, who had by this time become known as the sick man of Europe, were not able to hold it together, and Greece successfully fought for their independence against the Ottoman Empire in 1830. This is the one that people would most expect to see, the Open Rebellion, and the two most notable open rebellions are the Sepoy Mutiny, which occurs when Indian soldiers are forced to use pig fat to grease their guns, and other British cultural insensitivities cause these sepoys to revolt. Even though it's not a successful revolt in that Britain stays in the area, it changes the way Britain rules over the Indians and creates sort of this pseudo-nationalistic feeling among Indian people. You also see the Boxer Rebellion, which is an anti-Western revolt in China between 1899 and 1901 that causes the death of millions of people. It also is not successful in that the Western spheres of influence remain largely intact. You also see places appeal to the laws of the imperializing force. So when the United States was pushing westward early in its existence, it ran into the Cherokee Nation in what is now Georgia, and the Cherokee actually took the United States to court, and the Supreme Court, while it ruled in favor of the Cherokee Nation, the president at the time did not hold it out, and eventually those Cherokees were removed. Some places respond with religiously based responses, as was seen in the Xhosa cattle killing in South Africa, where they thought that if they killed their cattle and destroyed their plantations, the imperializing forces would disappear. This was largely unsuccessful. However, practicing historical empathy is important here because it made sense to them at the time. And lastly, one thing that colonial people who were fighting against colonial powers could do is simply embrace the imperial powers and not fight back. This is seen all over the board, but an important example to think about, especially if you're somebody in my class, is that some Africans just converted to Christianity and went along with the westernization. So there are several different ways that one could have, that places could have responded to imperialism. I don't want you to think that conquered people just laid down. I also don't want you to think that conquered people always rebelled. It's a little bit more complicated than that. Okay, and finally, key concept 5.2, Roman numeral 2. In some imperial societies, emerging cultural, religious, and racial ideologies, including social Darwinism, were used to justify imperialism. So now we get to talk about how Europeans justified what they were doing. Well, they did so in a couple different ways. One, they used religion, convincing themselves that Christianity was better than the heathenous and uncivilized religions of the people that they were conquering, whether it be for human sacrifice or it be for matrilineal forms of organization. Christians just thought that they were better and that their religion would save the barbaric people that did not currently believe in it. And it did gain a lot of converts during the time period, so there must have been something that was appealing in that message. Another is just basically bringing civilization to Africa. So the Europeans had a lot to offer. They had industrialization, as seen in the improved rail networks in Africa and India. They had improvements in medicine, like quinine medicine that was used to thwart the effects of malaria in Africa. You also see the push of education, and literacy rates go up in these places. So it's not that, well, we won't even go there. Anyways, Europeans brought what they considered civilization to a peoples that they thought were uncivilized. And then finally, there's a racial element here. A prevailing idea at the time was social Darwinism, or the use of Darwin's evolution theory and applying it to races, saying that some races are just fit to conquer and fit to rule, whereas others are fit to be ruled. It's sort of an Aristotelian logic there that some people deserve to be slaves and some people deserve to be masters. Anyways, this is all wrapped up in a popular poem at the time that was written by Rudyard Kipling, the guy who wrote The Jungle Book, and it basically argued that white people, it didn't make sense for them to go into a place where they might get malaria and that they might die. And so they were really taking it upon themselves and burdening themselves with this call to civilize the uncivilized world. So this is how Europeans justified this imperialistic foray. So I don't want to spend too much time on here, but you might respond to me by saying, yeah, Mr. Olson, so what could have been done? Well, what was the other option? Well, okay, I'll concede that Europe has its advances. It definitely was more medicinally advanced. It definitely was the most industrial place in the world. Okay, so they had notable areas of society and areas of life in which they were more progressive, if you will, than other places. So the thing that you do is you figure out a way to integrate this progress or these advances into the other societies in ways that avoid death, avoid stealing land, and involves compensation for the resources that you're taking out. It does not involve taking over and forcing with a whip made out of hippopotamus hide people to work on your behalf and not compensating them for what you take. If you want to argue that private property is something, then you have to also acknowledge that the people who lived in Africa prior to European arrival owned that land. And therefore, for Europeans to take that land, be it through legitimate or illegitimate contracts or military takeover or coercion, is not cool. Okay, so you figure out a way to not allow Europe to force its culture and way of life on subjective peoples, and you let them live the way that they want to live, while sharing some ideas that you have, and perhaps they might share resources back. Anyways, take it for what it's worth. That's how we reach nirvana. This is your Buddha, signing off.